Today on Locked On Canadians with a very special guest, why should Habs fans be excited about Lane Hutson?
Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 791. And we thank you for making us your first listen of the day, wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. My name is Laura Saba, and I am joined today by a very special guest in lieu of my co-host, Hadi Kalakeche, who is a public scout, host of Locked On NHL Prospects, and Hadi's work has appeared on Eyes on the Prize, Dobber Prospects, among other places. Hadi, thank you so much for giving me your time today.
Of course, no problem at all. I love talking about Habs prospects, so I'm more than happy to come on.
So if you don't follow Hadi on Twitter, this is where you find out, you should, because this is where you find out about what Lane Hutson has been up to. And we're going to get to Lane Hutson in just a second. So today we're going to talk earliest about the players that are most likely to either get a cup of coffee or even make the Habs soonest. And then later on, maybe it'll take a little bit more time or it's a little bit of a longer shot. And then in the final segment today, we're going to talk about who might be available for the Habs to draft in the first round in this upcoming draft. So why don't we start? I think, to me, Owen Beck has already had his game with the Montreal Canadiens. So I feel like Owen Beck should be where we start. How's he been doing, particularly since the trade? I know you've been keeping an eye on how he's been doing, and people were kind of not super overwhelmed with his first performance in the NHL. But I think he's still cooking.
Yeah, no, 100%. And, I always favor, learning translatable elements, learning projectable elements that'll work in the NHL above point production. For me, it's kind of an overblown kind of situation when it comes to, a player who's going to destroy records in the CHL or anything like that. I'd much rather have my player, produce a point a game, maybe even under, and actually learn some stuff that'll help him at the next level. Essentially, it's more important how the points are scored than how many. And with Owen Beck, the production has been underwhelming since his trade to Peterborough. He's got 11 points in 16 games, but he's mostly been playing in a sort of secondary role. He's not playing on that top line with Peterborough. He has shared some time with Brendan Othman. It's kind of gone on a cold streak since being matched with Owen Beck, just because Beck is very much a forward who likes to focus on the defensive side, and he's been placed in a situation where he's shutting down the opposition more often than not. And with the amount of firepower that's on Peterborough, that ice time is sort of spread out, and he's mostly been faced with defensive zone face-offs, mostly been sort of facing those kind of situations. So I wouldn't worry too much in Owen Beck's case in terms of the production dropping. He was at 41 points in 30 games before the trade when he was playing for the Mississauga Steelheads, and then it goes to 11 points in 16 games. That's obviously, a big downgrade in terms of the production, but his play hasn't changed at all. And what I like is that his audition in the NHL did show some flashes of what we're going to see more consistently in the future with Owen Beck, which is a player who's going to man the transition really well, who's going to make some decent defensive plays, win you a couple faceoffs. He's a very dependable and consistent player. It's very rare that he's going to have, off shifts, take his foot off the gas, constantly pushing transition. That's the kind of stuff that I like to see from a prospect. And that's why I think Owen Beck is not necessarily the closest to the NHL, but among the closest. He's got the most sort of pro-ready elements to his game.
Right. And that's the thing is like one of the things that you were just talking about is, how well he was doing on his previous team. And for me, I think the fact that you're talking about projectable elements, he needs to improve at every level, particularly with a role as he's going to be a middle six, potentially like a third line center. Like those defensive responsibilities need to be developed. So if he's staying on a team where he's coasting and he's able to destroy easily, he's not necessarily learning anything new or improving anything that needed improvement. So for me, I'm also not too concerned about Owen Beck. I think it's really interesting that you said that he might not be the closest, because the person I want to bring up next is somebody who it's rumored or whatever. We all know that Sean Farrell is going to sign his entry-level contract once he's done with his NCAA season. So let's talk about this kid, the small Goals Boy 2.0.
He is insane. I love this player on multiple levels. He was pretty much a pure playmaker in his draft year with, poor skating mechanics. He's improved his skating and he's added a tremendous shot on top of that. I mean, he's over an assist per game right now with Harvard. 29 assists, 46 points in 27 games so far this year for them. And he's been pretty much their best player. And that's saying something given that, one of his frequent line mates and a big name on that team is Matt Coronado, who was a high-end first-round pick in his draft year. So you look at Farrell's, playing style, and you just see so much that's just it works so well in any top six. The way that he attracts players to him, he's got this sort of magnetic field where he just draws in opponents and opens up so much space for his line mates. And not only is he able to draw players in, he's able to play through them. He's able to pass through sticks like they don't exist. He finds the smallest of seams and opens them up with his body positioning, with his stick handling. He's a really, really good handler as well, which helps him sort of navigate tight scenarios. He does need to add some core strength, which I think is only the pretty much the only thing that's stopping him from making the jump pretty much right away. But that's something he can work at in the gym. It's not something that he needs to improve on the ice. Everything he does on the ice is so intelligent, so refined, so advanced. For me, he's the closest to the NHL and the most likely of all the Habs prospects to make it in a full-time top six role.
And that's the thing, right? Like whenever he does sign his entry level, if he does, I'm very, very skeptical of like the possibility that he wouldn't. It's going to be a few games with the Canadiens, and then he's going to go home with a conditioning assignment for the summer, right? So, for me, the fact that you said that he was able to improve his skating was the key, because we initially, when he was drafted, even Scott would call him the small assists boy, not the small goals boy. So he's kind of like really taken steps in that area, but you find that with a lot of prospects, sometimes the knock on them is their skating. And if they're never able to improve that, they don't become full-time NHLers, or at least not for a long time. So for me, like, it's very promising that Sean Farrell was not only willing, but also able to do that. And I know it's not easy for every player, but it's a big component of being part of a fast-skilled team in today's NHL.
And a big part of that is Adam Nicholas, right? Because Adam Nicholas, I'd say Sean Farrell is almost definitely the prospect he spent the most time with. Adam Nicholas and Sean Farrell, started off with the Chicago Steel. Nicholas was one of the guys who was tasked with prospect development in Chicago. He became their main guy at one point. Then he got hired to the Habs. So he's been following Sean Farrell since before his draft year, a couple years before his draft year. So he's got a really good understanding of Sean Farrell's strengths and weaknesses. And Adam Nicholas's masterpiece, because all of the elements that exist in Farrell's game are things that Adam Nicholas values so much. Inside play, manipulation, attracting opponents, like I mentioned, his ability to change the angle of his passes, his understanding of body positioning and board battles. All those things are things that that Adam Nicholas prones when it comes to prospect development, and it shows that Sean Farrell has been the prospect who spent the most time with Nicholas. I think that, adding Adam Nicholas to this organization and to this development team was probably the best thing, not just for Sean Farrell, but for all the Habs prospects. They could all benefit from the intelligence, the understanding of what works in the NHL that Adam Nicholas brings to the table.
And it answers a lot of questions that the previous regimes have had about development, because you could have potential. If the player's not able to achieve it, it's partly in the player's hands and partly in the organization's hands.
For sure.
And so we're going to try to turn our attention to somebody who's a little bit more familiar to Canadiens fans, both because he's kind of in the market, as well as, the World Juniors. So Joshua Roy, how's he been doing? Let's just do a quick check-in on Joshua Roy, just because we can.
So he has been doing really well, of course. Since he returned from the World Juniors, he's had a decent amount of multi-point games. He had a 5-point game the other day in an 8-2 win against St. John. He's up to 71 points in 42 games. So pretty similar production to what he performed last year. The thing with Joshua Roy is I don't think he's necessarily adding anything to his game by playing in the QMJHL right now. He's just kind of working in the same stuff that he did. But what he showed at the World Juniors is that he has added some elements to his game in the summer. He's always been a good physical player. He's always been good at establishing body positioning, at working and out muscling his opponents along the boards. And he's always been a good sort of static shooter. From a standpoint, he's able to rifle the puck really easily. That's why he's so good on the half wall on the power play. But he's added some playmaking elements. He's added some inside play, more of a tendency to drive transitions. That was the big main thing that was lacking in Joshua Roy's game, is that he barely got involved in transitions at all, from his draft year up to last year. And now this year, even now in the QMJHL, it's mainly his teammates, Ethan Gauthier, who's a 2023 draft eligible, and Justin Gill. Those were the main, transition drivers on his team, but it's mostly systematic. With Team Canada, he was able to carry the puck into the offensive zone and more than willing to do so when he was tasked with that. But I don't think that's going to be a staple of his game moving forward. I think what you can expect from Joshua Roy is a guy who's going to go in the corners, win you some puck battles, get off the wall with the puck, and take some shots. He's really good at sneaking behind opponents, sneaking behind their heels to find space. So all of those things are things that can work. It doesn't make him as much of a complete player as, let's say, Sean Farrell, who does all those things minus the strength, the core strength, but does all those things on top of having elite playmaking and elite transition ability. So that's why I think Joshua Roy is more of sort of a fringe second line, third line sort of ceiling player. He's almost definitely going to fill out that depth on the Canadiens and give them some good results, some consistent results in that bottom six and occasionally on that second line. But I don't think we can expect Joshua Roy to be a full-time top six player, at least not yet, until he refines his skating further and hopefully adds even more willingness to drive transitions. If he becomes a main transition driver on his line, then we can talk about that scenario, that possibility. But for me right now, I see Joshua Roy as almost definite NHLer, but in a more sort of muted role than someone like Sean Farrell.
So if you're a team that wants to roll lines and wants I know, people are sick of hearing this on our podcast. I always talk about your bottom six quality. Like, they can't be replacement level. Like, there's such a thing as a better bottom six, even a better fourth line than any other team, right? So you have to work on filling those roles with talent. And I think Joshua Roy is probably a possibility. So we are going to turn our attention to players that might be a little bit further away, but we might be potentially more excited about. And that's coming up in just one moment. But first, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. The midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, the America's #1 sportsbook. New customers will get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained. Plus, FanDuel is even going to let you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA, as well as us right here. They're our official sports betting partner too. All right, so I am here with Hadi, Kalakeche of Locked On NHL Prospects, Habs Eyes on the Prize, Dobber Prospects, and we just talked lots of stuff everywhere. I love talking to public scouts because they're always like, "You can find my work here," and then I did an article here for that, and then I did a video analysis here. I love it, and it's such a great community too. At least I hope your experience of it is as great as our experience of it as hosts.
Absolutely.
So we talked in our first segment about players that are maybe a little bit closer to making the Habs. And now we're going to talk about some players that are potentially a little bit further, maybe a little bit higher risk, high reward, but players that we should be excited about nevertheless. So I'm going to start. I've been waiting for this. So I'm going to ask you right off the bat about the one I want to know the most about. Why should Canadiens fans, other than just myself, be excited about defenseman Lane Hutson?
Well, to put it simply, I don't think there's a more dynamic and more fun player in the NCAA. Maybe Adam Fantilli. Lane Hutson's ability to just manipulate play, to manipulate opponents, it's amazing to watch. Every time you watch him, every time he gets the puck, like fans get on the edge of their seats. Something's happening, especially when he gets it on a low to high pass at the offensive blue line. He's gonna walk that blue line. He's gonna shift an opponent. He's gonna drive inside, play a give and go. He's so daring and so elusive and shifty. It's so lovely to see the Habs take a shot on a prospect like this. It's been so long since we've had a prospect with this caliber of talent in the system. The only thing for Moses is skating, because we talk about his defensive play being lackluster, being poor, but that's actually a result of his skating being an issue. Hutson is really good when it comes to shifting left to right, but as soon as it comes to pivots, as soon as it comes to any scenario where he has to use his outside edges, it becomes an issue. And that's the defensive rushes, because right now, as soon as you're big enough, as soon as you're fast enough, or as soon as you have a long enough reach, you can get around him really easily. And that's because his pivots are an issue. And I think that Adam Nicholas is probably the best person to solve that problem with Lane Hutson. So I'm not worried about that at all. I've already seen some improvements in his pivots this year. It's something that's improved. It's something that's resulted in 38 points in 29 games as a defenseman, a freshman defenseman. He's probably going to be a Hobie Baker candidate as a freshman by the end of this year. He's been that good. Pretty much leads all defensemen in points per game. We've never seen results like this since the likes of Adam Fox and Quinn Hughes and Zach Werenski. He's in that tier of production in his freshman year. So it's just, you combine all that, and it's obvious what the excitement is about, especially given that for me, the only thing that is limiting him right now and making him such a high risk, high reward prospect is his skating. And given who the Habs added in the offseason in order to surround their players, Adam Nicholas's main strength is improving his players' skating mechanics. We saw it with Sean Farrell when he headed out of the Chicago Steel at the end of his dominant campaign with him, where he put up 100 plus points. That year, he consistently improved his skating, and we're seeing it this year with Lane Hutson. So I'm not concerned at all with Lane Hutson being to a point where he's able to contribute defensively, because anything that's within his reach defensively, he has no problem with. Anything that he can keep up with, his brain is advanced enough to understand threats. It's just that his body's not keeping up with his brain. So he doesn't need to learn any sort of mental elements or technical elements that will improve his defensive play. Maybe his posture, but that'll come with the skating. So for me, as soon as you solve that skating, you've got an elite defenseman in Lane Hutson. I'm very excited about him.
So there's one concern that one of our listeners brought up, and I'm so sorry, I do not remember which one it was. And it was that in all the games that they had seen Lane Hutson play, they hadn't necessarily seen him kind of out muscled and like bullied around by a larger body. I haven't watched all of his games, so I'm not sure if that's true, but it's definitely a concern that if he were to move into an AHL or NHL role, it's definitely like that kind of being sort of bullied around by size or physicality. Like in my mind, I feel like he has the ability to become fast enough that won't be an issue. I mean, we thought about that with Cole Caulfield, and we're not seeing that right now. Like he'll just skate around people, right? So my hope is that Lane Hutson will be able to improve his skating and his what do you call it, his posture, like you said, like just to be slippery enough to just not have to worry about that.
Yeah, I mean, the defensive game is kind of different than a winger. Cole Caulfield can get away with not being involved almost at all in physical battles because he's so good at finding space off the puck offensively. But a defenseman's job, it's part of the job description, is to clear the net front, to get in those corners, go on retrievals. Obviously, that's going to be kind of a different scenario with Hutson, but I've personally seen him clear the net front more than often enough that I'm not concerned about it. And I call this the Xavier Simoneau effect, because I talk about him a lot and how he's adapted to his lack of size, because he's like 5'6", 5'7". Um, if a player is smaller than anyone else their entire lives, and they're constantly playing above their age group, they're constantly playing against bigger, stronger competition and thriving, like Cole Caulfield has, like Xavier Simoneau has, like Lane Hutson is right now, it's because they've developed the adaptive skills to work around their size already. And that's promising. That means that they've compensated for the lack of size, and that won't be an issue as they climb the ranks because it won't be anything new. I'm actually more concerned with a player who's 6'4", 200 pounds at 17, 18, and who's already, bullying opponents physically, who's already out muscling them in his age group, because as he reaches the NHL, that competitive advantage disappears. Whereas someone like Lane Hutson, it's nothing new to them to go in the corner with a winger that's bigger than them, you know? So it's kind of it's all about adaptive skills and what you learn along the way. And I think that Lane Hutson has been able to add some elements to his game through experiences throughout his whole life playing against bigger and stronger opponents that will continue to benefit him in the NHL. The way that he approaches retrievals to me is really interesting. For example, he pivots early, skates back early, and when like I mentioned, if you're big and strong and if you're big and fast enough, you're going to get around him. But let's say on dump ins, he pivots early, he anticipates the dump in, goes back, retrieves it, and it doesn't stay on his stick long. He doesn't try to maintain possession for a long while behind his net or try to he pretty much avoids 50-50 battles by just anticipating play early, scanning a whole bunch of times, and already knowing what his next play is going to be before he touches a puck. So in a way, he does avoid those scenarios, but inevitably there's going to come a time where he's going to go in the corner against a big strong winger like a Mikko Rantanen, in the NHL if he reaches that level. And it's important for him to be able to continue to outsmart them, but also be able to outskate them. That's not really something that he'll be able to do at where he is right now, but I'm confident that that improves and he works that out of his game and he's able to consistently outskate his opponents. Because otherwise, you get a situation like an Eric Brandstrom in Ottawa, where you got a fluid skater, but doesn't anticipate play that well. And then gets stuck on retrievals with its back to the play, not really knowing what to do, and kind of a big winger closing in on him. That's been one of the main issues with Brandstrom, and that's prevented him from succeeding so far. I don't see that being a concern with Hutson because of how smart he is, but his skating does need to reach another level so that his feet can keep up.
And that's the thing. The good thing about Lane Hutson is that as excited as we are with him, I think we all have to acknowledge that he's quite a ways away from us having to worry about that. Like there's still years of development left in him to prepare him for that role.
Yeah.
And I got so wrapped up in the conversation about Lane Hutson that I completely forgot about the other two players we were going to discuss in the segment. So let's quickly talk about Riley Kidney's tear and check in on Filip Mesar just because people have a lot of questions on how he's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So Riley Kidney right now, he was traded to the Gatineau Olympique, and he's been doing tremendous since then. 38 points in 15 games. I was of the group of public scouts that were concerned with his projectability and saw him more as a junior scorer, but he's added something this year that has kind of changed my mind on that and kind of added some more promise to his profile. And is basically he turned his biggest weakness into a decent strength, and that's his inside play. With Kidney, the big issue was he never drove the middle. He never tried to push off the wall with the puck and bring it to the middle of the ice and make plays from there. The only time where the puck would go from the boards to the middle with him was when he was throwing it at the front of the net for sort of a Hail Mary pass. That's kind of been weaned out of his game, and now he's constantly driving the inside. He's at least trying to find ways to get the puck off the boards and make plays, in open ice rather than just being stuck with his back to the boards and trying to make a pass into one thing that's improved a lot in this game. And that's what's leading to such strong results this year. And especially now that he's paired with guys that complement him really well and gets they've got a really, really strong forward group with the likes of Alexis Gendron, Olivier Nadeau. All those guys are kind of hard workers that can help him along the boards and allow him to sort of be in scenarios where he's not necessarily struggling with two guys on his back. It's always like a 2-on-2 or a 3-on-2 along the boards. That gives him more leeway to be able to get off the boards. So that's one thing that's really helped Kidney, and that's kind of resulting in these strong results. So I'd say he's gone from, a best case scenario third liner to a likely third liner for me.
And honestly, that sounds good because the other thing that we talk about sometimes on this podcast, we're talking about all these prospects. And sometimes when people ask us, can you project the lineup 2 years from now, 3 years from now? Like there's so many players. And then we have to remember that not all of them are going to make the NHL. But the more potential you have, A, it gives you more tools, and B, it gives you more trade chips.
Yeah.
And finally, Filip Mesar. To me, Filip Mesar is one of the most intriguing people because we, as not just as a podcast, as a fan base, we hadn't necessarily scouted him as heavily as we would have had we known that that was going to be somebody the Canadians were going to look at, right? Like we were basing all of our opinions on past I'm going to say past administrations.
Yeah.
So that was it was a fun pick because he seems to have the skill level that is just it's so tantalizing and promising.
Yeah.
So let's talk about him real quick because I think it's kind of confusing, like the way it's panned out on his teams in the OHL. It's not making a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, I've got some connections on the Kitchener side, some people who follow him a lot closely who are from Ontario. From what I've heard, the coaching has been awful, and hasn't resulted in the best scenarios for Meshar. There was a recent coaching change, I believe, that might help in that case. But you watch his production last year, in his draft year with a pro team in Slovakia, 16 points in 37 games. That's promising results for a player playing pro as an undersized forward. Then he goes to the OHL. Now he's got 37 points in 38 games. And obviously, you ask kind of what's going on there. But there are a lot of scenarios around that. He wasn't getting the best opportunities. He wasn't deployed in the best roles. He was playing on a struggling team that was having trouble putting goals in the back of the net, regardless of who was on the ice. So you take all that into consideration, and for me, Mishar is still a prospect who's got some pro elements. For me, he's a pro mind stuck in a junior body, and that'll improve. A player can grow, a player can add weight. That's not an issue for me. He might continue and maybe 190-pound, winger or center. I see him more as a center given his skill set, but I wouldn't be too concerned because his skill set is so clear. It's so obvious. He's so good at weaving through traffic, at carrying the puck from the defensive zone to the offensive zone, and just making plays in tight with really good playmaking elements. Overall, I wouldn't be too concerned with that, but it'll take more time to sort of figure out exactly who Filip Mesar is, especially given the role that he's in right now. It's really tough to scout him.
And I think that's kind of an issue with Filip Mesar is that it's going to be a while before we know, I think. But I still find, obviously he's a first rounder, but that's not it. Like that, there's the cognitive bias associated with that. But I do think that there have been elements of his skill that have been very, very promising. And I really like what you said about the pro mind stuck in a junior body, because the hockey smarts is what this team is all about, or what the future team that they want to contend with is. And then in our next segment, what we are going to talk about is I specifically asked Hadi for thoughts on who the Canadians might draft, but I didn't want to mention any names myself because I didn't want to bring any bias into this conversation. So in one moment, we're going to talk about who the Canadians may draft with their 2 first-round picks this upcoming draft. All right, so the Canadians are likely to end up right now. If you look at it, they're drafting 7th and 11th overall. Things might change. There's still enough games in the season for the Canadians to drop dramatically, which I know some listeners are concerned that that's not happening enough, and they're not going to get a game breaker. Also, some listeners, including myself, I'm not just a listener, but I'm also a little bit concerned about Florida not being as bad as they promised to be, in December. So I just want to know, what your ranking is in that area. So let's say 5 to 12, right? Because the Canadians could drop as low as drafting 5th, or they might win the lottery and move up a couple of spots, right? So who's maybe give us a quick rundown of your ranking, and then who 1 or 2 players that you're most excited about.
Yeah, so in terms of ranking, is going to change around. My rankings right now are my rankings from January, and I've watched a lot of games since then, and things have worked around. Right now, who I've got for 7th overall is Edward Shala, but I've watched some games recently that have kind of made me doubt that. So he's probably going to be dropping. A couple of guys that I would consider if I'm the Habs. First and foremost, I think the right side of D in terms of the prospect pool is something that's lacking. So guys like Axel Sandin Pellikka, David Reinbacher, a couple of guys that I would consider in the sort of with the 11th pick. But if we're picking 7th overall, I would probably go for someone like Andrew Crystal, who I don't see talked about enough, but he's just tearing up the WHL right now. I've had some scouts tell me that he's in their 20s. I've had other scouts tell me that he's their second best WHL prospect, which is saying something because that means the only player ahead of him is Connor Bedard, right? And in between that, you've got names like Zach Benson, like Braden Yeager, and those guys are ranked high. So when a scout says Andrew Crystal is my second best WHL prospect, they're talking about a top 5 pick because Zach Benson is no slouch in the slightest. And Benson's probably going to be gone by 4 or 5. Now, if you're asking me, I think that the Habs should go for Matvei Michkov because I'm almost certain he's going to be slipping. But we've already got reports out of the Habs that they're not going to be going that route. That they probably won't be picking Matvei Michkov if he's available even at 7. So if we scratch that off the table and we consider that the Habs really want a top 6 center, you've got options. Either Zach Benson slips and you're extremely lucky and you get him. Either you get Will Smith. Oliver Moore can be in that conversation. There's a couple other guys. I wouldn't consider a guy like Dalibor Dvorsky, who's been linked to the Habs a lot, mainly because he slipped in my rankings. I'm not really too impressed with his play recently. He had a decent-ish World Juniors, but nothing out, to write home about. So, if we're going center and right D, let's say, which, teams always say they won't draft for position, they'll draft the best player available.
But then they
It's
do.
not the yeah, no. See, so if we're going center and right D, my bet is something like Will Smith and Axel Sandy Pellikka would probably be the best case scenario at 7-11. Um,
And also polar
but I wouldn't
opposites
be
in
against.
names. One has a very generic name and one has a really fun name.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, Axel Sandy Pellikka is up there with the best defenseman in this class, and he's right-handed, and he's extremely fluid, and he's really smart. Pretty much all the things that the Habs are going for by modernizing their style of play through Martin St. Louis. So I think he would be a great fit for directionally. So yeah, he's one option. Either him or David Reinbacher, who's a bit more traditional, but also really good on breakouts. Really good, a really good handler for a big guy. But sort of the more NHL GM pick, I would say.
So I'm going to go over a little bit with a couple of minutes because you know who we forgot to talk about, which is
Yeah.
somebody that is not super known. He's a Habs prospect,
Mhm.
Engstrom, right?
Yeah.
So you're one of the few people that I know that's willing to actually talk about how he's doing because most people are like, I don't really know. He's all the way over there. So
Yeah, no,
maybe
of
let's finish up
course.
with some thoughts on him, like a little bit of a bonus for our listeners.
So Adam Engstrom has been playing SHL minutes pretty much regularly this season. He started off as their 7th defenseman, was playing 1 every 2 games, was playing maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes a game. Now he's up to 15-minute average. He had a 20-minute game recently. He's been utilized in many different scenarios. He's been just surprising because his defensive issues are pretty, but he's really fluid offensively, really intelligent on the breakout, and he's constantly trying stuff. He's not that kind of reserved player who sticks to their guns. He's always exploring new venues in terms of what he can do. He's kind of feeling out what he can get away with and what works and what doesn't. And for me, experimentation is the best way to add new skills. And that's what I see from Engstrom right now. And Rugla is a really, really good system for prospects. They're the ones that produced Moritz Seider. They're the ones that produced Niels Höglander recently with Nux. They've got a good rap sheet, especially with defensemen right now. At one point, Adam Engstrom and I believe it was William Vollander, Detroit Red Wings prospect, that were their first pair. So basically, they had 2 extremely young defensemen on their first pair as an SHL team, and they were still being competitive. They're more than willing to give their youngsters opportunities and trust them. And I think that's the best environment for Adam Engstrom to learn some more sort of refined defensive skills, because obviously that's lacking. His gap control in rush defense it's iffy often. His defensive zone positioning is kind of an issue as well, but I like how often he scans. He checks his shoulders multiple times. So he's keeping sort of mental notes of where everyone is, but he has trouble situating himself within that. So if he works that out, I'd see a second pair defenseman out of Adam Engstrom aren't that high. He's just really smart and can find passes better than most defensemen, which is something that I really like to see the Habs take a shot on. He was kind of hidden behind Kalle Odelius and the 3 Swedish forwards from last year's draft. Was kind of coasting behind them, and wasn't really watched as much. So I was kind of surprised when the Habs took him in the third round. But, after watching his game, paying more attention to what he does well and what he needs to work on, it's kind of a good bet in the third round. I wouldn't sleep
That's
on
the
him.
thing too, is that like a lot of people are like, who? Um, and still, like
Yeah.
people are like, well, now we know his name, but do we know anything about him?
Mhm.
So I'm really glad that you were able to give us a little bit of perspective.
Yeah.
And I hope our listeners got a lot out of this episode because I certainly did.
Mm.
I learned a lot, and I'm even more excited now about all these players
Yeah.
and the future. So Hadi, can you please tell everybody where they can find your work?
Yeah, Twitter's a one-stop shop. You can find everything I do there, post everything I do there. It's Hadi K_scouting. So you can find me really easily in all my work there. But my articles come out on Habs Eyes on the Prize about once a week. I do some work for Dobber Prospects as their QMJHL scout, so I put out game reports from time to time. And I've got the Locked On NHL Prospects podcast, which should be up and running soon. We're taking a little break right now to restructure, maybe add some co-hosts, but we'll be back on the air very soon. We'll be able to get out some daily reports from you from the scouting world.
And as we get closer and closer to the draft, I think Canadiens fans are going to get a lot out of that. It's going to be very useful for them.
Yeah.
And obviously, I will ask you on again because I
Hopefully.
love talking prospects. Like, this is the thing as a Canadiens fan now, it's like we look at the games and we're like, and then we look at the immediate future and we're like, and then
Mhm.
we look like a little bit further in the future and we get excited. So that there's
Yeah.
going to be a lot more of that on Locked On Canadiens. So make sure you are subscribed to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. You will find us on Twitter at LO_Canadians. Don't forget your mailbag questions. Tomorrow's a mailbag day. You can email us at lockedoncanadians@gmail.com. You will find me at The Active Stick. You'll find Scott at Scott Matla. He's away for a while now, but you can still tweet him and see if he responds on his vacation. You can also leave mailbag questions in the YouTube comments. Just make sure you write mailbag questions because sometimes I can't tell if it's just a discussion point or if it's a mailbag question. So put mailbag question in the question on YouTube, and all of those I will answer for you on an episode tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you tomorrow.